Now, when it comes to Drake and what just unfolded inside a single 24-hour window on the biggest streaming platform on the planet, the entire narrative his camp has spent the last 6 months trying to manufacture just imploded in the most public, most documented, and most embarrassing way possible. And if you are sitting there wondering how a man who just got crowned the first artist in Spotify history to cross the 100 million monthly listener ceiling could turn around the very next day and bleed a full 1 million of those listeners off his count in a single rotation of the planet, well, you are about to find out, and I promise you the answer is not the answer his fan base wants to hear. Because this is not a story about fluctuation. This is not a story about a normal post-release dip. This is a story about a milestone that was announced like a coronation, and then collapsed like a controlled demolition within 48 hours of the press release going out. And running parallel to that collapse, on the exact same timeline, in the exact same week, the most laughable take in recent hip-hop history started getting pushed by the same circle of loyalists who saw the numbers slipping and panicked. The take, said out loud, with full chests, by people who should know better, was that Kendrick Lamar should be entirely disqualified from any GO conversation because he has only released 6 studio albums in 15 years. 6 albums. Disqualified. From a Pulitzer Prize winner, a Super Bowl headliner, a man whose last tour broke records, and the artist who just won the most consequential rap battle of the streaming era. That is not a take. That is a confession. And what makes all of this just seem a little more important is that these 2 stories are not actually 2 stories. They are one story, told from 2 ends of the same broken rope. And by the time we get to the contract structure, the bot allegations, the streaming farm operator, who already said the quiet part out loud, and the family silence nobody on the Iceman side wants to acknowledge, you're going to understand exactly why this week was not a bad week for Drake. This week was a reckoning. So buckle in, because we have layers to peel back here. Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like, and subscribe. Let's get into it. So let me set the table properly. Because the only way you understand the size of this collapse is if you understand the size of the celebration it was supposed to be. Drake, born Aubrey Drake Graham, has spent the better part of 15 years building himself into the most commercially dominant rap artist of the streaming era. That is not in dispute. Nobody serious is denying the chart runs, the radio dominance, the playlist saturation, the cross-genre crossover, or the sheer mechanical efficiency of the OVO machine when it is operating at full capacity. The man has been a hit factory, a brand, a label, a clothing line, a sports investment portfolio, and a cultural lightning rod all at once for longer than some of his current critics have been old enough to write a hip-hop think piece. That context matters, because when somebody at that altitude celebrates a milestone, they do not celebrate quietly. The 100 million monthly listener mark on Spotify was framed by his camp as a historic moment, the kind of number that gets attached to your name in retrospectives for the next 20 years. The press releases went out. The blogs picked up. The screenshots circulated. The Iceman defenders did their full lap. And then, in the very next 24-hour reporting window, the number did not climb. It did not even hold. It cratered by over 1 million listeners, making Drake the first artist in Spotify's history to hit that ceiling and then immediately fall off it in the very next data refresh. Now, parallel to all of this, you have Kendrick Lamar Duckworth, the West Coast lyricist, who less than 2 years ago walked into the most public rap battle of the modern era and walked out of it with a Pulitzer-grade catalog, a Super Bowl halftime show that became the most watched halftime in the history of the broadcast, a tour that broke records, and a diss track in Not Like Us that effectively rewired the cultural perception of the man on the other side of the battle. So when Drake's numbers started sliding, his fan base did not respond by defending the music. They did not point to the songs. They did not point to a verse or a moment or a feature. They pivoted reflexively to the same place they always pivot when the temperature in the room shifts against them, which is to invent a new metric on the fly that conveniently disqualifies Kendrick Lamar from the conversation entirely. And the metric they reached for this time, the 6-album rule, is the most self-defeating argument they have made yet. The stakes here are not just about who is winning a streaming war this month. The stakes are about whether the entire mythology of the modern hip-hop superstar was built on numbers that were never as solid as the public was told. Whether the catalog you are told to respect is the catalog the algorithm actually trusts. And whether the people closest to the man at the center of the story are quietly already telling you, through their silence, what they think of the whole rollout. So the question we are working toward, the question this entire breakdown answers, is simple. Was this collapse natural? Or was this collapse the moment the scaffolding finally got pulled? Let us start with what you can actually see with your own eyes, because the surface layer of this story is already damning before we get anywhere near the deeper, systemic issues. Piece of evidence number 1 is the Spotify counter itself. The screenshots are everywhere. The 100 million monthly listener number, posted, celebrated, framed as a historic crossing of the threshold, and then in the very next reporting window, the number sitting over 1 million lower. Not flat, not slightly down, a full 7-figure drop in a single 24-hour cycle, at exactly the moment in a rollout where the number is supposed to be peaking. And the loyalists immediately ran to the comments to scream that this is normal fluctuation. And to be fair, a portion of any post-release movement absolutely is mechanical. When any artist drops a major project, you get a wave of casual listeners who are not actually fans of that artist. They are just curious. They press play because the entire internet is plastered with the rollout. They sample 2 songs, and they move on. So when that initial cycle turns over, you do see a drop. That is the math-driven side of it, and even hardened Kendrick Lamar fans will admit on a baseline level that some movement was inevitable. But a one-day, 1 million listener hemorrhage at exactly the moment a rollout is supposed to be at peak velocity. That is not a tide going out. That is a crack in the foundation. Piece of evidence number 2 is the album performance itself. The replay value on the Iceman project, according to every public engagement metric circulating, was burned within the first cycle. A huge portion of the people who pressed play on day 1 were not Drake stans. They were Kendrick Lamar fans, hip-hop fans, journalists, podcasters, and casual listeners running a forensic sweep through the track list, looking for one thing, which was how many shots did he fire? And at who? He fired a lot. The biggest target on the wall was, of course, Kendrick Lamar. So once those listeners harvested the dices, dissected them, made their videos, and filed them away, they had no reason to come back. The replay was burned the second the analysis was done. The album was not built to be lived with. It was built to be argued about. And once the argument cools, the streams cool with it. Piece of evidence number 3 is the bot operator quote. For over a year now, there has been a very specific accusation hanging over every Drake streaming milestone, and it is not coming from random Twitter accounts. It is coming from people inside the streaming farm world, including one alleged operator who openly stated that Drake was, in his own words, one of his biggest clients, if not the biggest. Now, I am not here to convict anybody on a single sentence. But when you stack that quote on top of the album debut numbers, on top of the rumored sleep playlist tactics, where superfans loop the project all night while they sleep just to pump the count, on top of the streams that previously looked like they were coming from tiny villages and regions where Drake has no real listening footprint, you do not even need to be a forensic accountant to notice the pattern. Piece of evidence number 4 is the Kendrick Lamar comparison line. Kendrick Lamar has not released a new studio album in nearly 2 years. He is not actively in market. He is not feeding the algorithm with new product. And he is still parked at around 80 million monthly listeners with a fraction of Drake's catalog size, which, if you actually understand how streaming economies work, is a borderline impossible feat of cultural staying power. The man is generating numbers a working artist would kill for while technically resting. Does everybody understand how crazy that actually is? An artist sitting on the bench, not promoting, not releasing, not feeding the machine, is holding a number that the man currently, in full rollout mode, just lost in one night. That is not weakness. That is the proof of concept. And we are only at layer 1. And oh, do I have more for you. The stans are really not going to like this next part, because what we are about to walk into is the cultural reaction layer. The part where you find out that the people who actually live inside this genre, the artists, the affiliates, the people in the room when these decisions get made, have already been telling you what they think, mostly through what they are not saying. The silence is the statement. So if you thought the Spotify counter was the embarrassing part, wait until we get to the family fallout, the imitator who got publicly humbled at a function, and the unofficial West Coast coalition that has been building in plain sight while everybody was watching the wrong scoreboard. We are just getting started. So let me get into the cultural layer, because this is where the story stops being about a number and starts being about a vibe shift. The first piece of cultural evidence is the family silence. While Drake was busy on his own project mocking other men for their parenting setups, and while the rollout was supposedly being celebrated by his inner circle, there has been a deafening silence from the women he is publicly tied to. Sophie, the mother of his son, has not been amplifying the album. Rihanna, who has nothing to do with Drake at this point and is famously about to get married on Father's Day to a man who is decidedly not Drake, was obviously not amplifying the album either. And the silence from the women he has publicly attached himself to across multiple cycles becomes its own subliminal commentary the longer it stretches out. People talk about what they support. They post what they support. They tag what they support. The absence of that posting across a rollout that was supposed to be a cultural moment is a tell. Piece of cultural evidence number 2 is the fake Drake clip. There is a clip going around of a Drake lookalike, a man who has literally built his entire public presence around resembling Drake, walking into an event and being introduced on stage as fake Drake. And his reaction on camera is to get genuinely offended and demand to be called by his real name, John. Listen, if you have spent years adopting the haircut, the beard, the wardrobe, the chains, the cadence, the stage moves, and the entire performative aesthetic of one specific artist, you do not get to be shocked when the room calls you the fake version of that artist. That is the brand you built. That is the IP you are renting. And the deeper meaning of that moment, the part nobody is saying out loud, is that even the people whose entire income depends on imitating Drake are starting to be visibly embarrassed when they are publicly associated with the name. The reputational gravity has flipped. 2 years ago, you wanted to be the fake Drake at the function. Today, you want to introduce yourself as Julian or John or literally anything else. Piece of cultural evidence number 3 is the response pattern from the loyalist fan base across multiple flashpoints. When Kendrick Lamar walked into Disneyland for the pop-out, they said it was AI. When Not Like Us became the most streamed diss track in modern history, they said it was bot. When the Super Bowl numbers came back as the most watched halftime show ever, they said it was rigged. And now that Drake's own numbers are slipping a month into his own rollout, the response is, well, Kendrick Lamar should not even be in the conversation. Can we stop and acknowledge what is actually happening here? Every single time the man on the other side of this battle wins a measurable, documented, public victory, the response from the Iceman side is to dispute the measurement, not to compete with it, to dispute it. The mental gymnastics deserve their own Olympic event, and the judges would be handing out 10s. Piece of cultural evidence number 4 is the West Coast coalition that has been quietly building underneath all of this noise. While Drake's camp has been putting out features with the same 3 or 4 collaborators on rotation, Kendrick Lamar has effectively built a parallel coalition that is producing music headlines and cultural momentum without him even needing to be the lead artist on the song. The unofficial mentorship of artists like YG, the orbit that includes Absol, Rayvon, J-Rock, Reason, the connective tissue of PG Lang and TDE moving in sync, the cross-pollination with East Coast lyricists like JID, all of it is moving in the same direction at the same time. That is empire architecture. That is what builds legacies that outlive trend cycles. And now I want to actually steelman the other side for a second, because if I do not, this whole breakdown sounds like a pep rally, and that is not what we are here for. The strongest counterargument the Drake camp has been pushing is that Kendrick Lamar also lost a chunk of his monthly listeners coming off the Super Bowl bounce, and that proves both artists are subject to the same gravitational pull. And on the surface, sure, Kendrick Lamar did dip from his peak. But the difference, the part the counterargument deliberately leaves out, is that Kendrick Lamar dipped from a peak he hit while not releasing new music. He was riding a residual cultural wave. Drake dipped while in full rollout mode, with a brand new album in active circulation, with the entire machine running at full output. One artist is parked. The other one is driving. And the parked artist is still ahead of where the driving artist landed. Does anybody actually understand how telling that is? That is not a counterargument. That is an own goal. And what makes all of this just seem a little more important is the gear shift we have to make right now, because everything we have talked about so far is surface and culture. The real story, the one that actually explains why these numbers move the way they do, is the system underneath them. So buckle up, because we are about to leave the entertainment side of this entirely. Here is where everything changes. Because if you only understand the story through the lens of who has better songs and who has better numbers, you are missing the actual machine. The machine is the streaming economy, and the streaming economy is not what the average fan thinks it is. It is not a meritocracy. It is not a popularity contest decided by listeners pressing play. It is a financial ecosystem where every play is a fraction of a cent, where every monthly listener number translates into label leverage, where every algorithmic placement is the result of a negotiation that happened in a room nobody films. And when you understand that, you start to understand why a 1 million listener drop in a single day is not just embarrassing. It is structurally catastrophic. The first systemic angle you have to understand is the platform incentive. Spotify is not sitting in a vault somewhere with their fingers in their ears, pretending none of this manipulation is happening. They are a business. Every single bot stream, every sleep playlist scheme, every clone location farm is money out of their pocket they would rather not pay. So they are actively building systems to detect it, scrub it, and refuse to count it. And when those systems flip on, guess whose numbers move the most? The artists whose numbers were the most inflated to begin with. That is not a Kendrick Lamar conspiracy. That is just how the math of fraud detection works. The cleaner the platform gets, the worse certain artists are going to look. And the closer you are sitting to the manipulated edge, the further you are going to fall when the scrub passes through. So when you see a 1 million listener drop in a single day, at exactly the moment a major artist crosses a major milestone, you have to at least ask the question, did that artist cross the milestone? Or did the platform let the milestone happen and then immediately correct it on the next refresh? Because that timing is suspicious, and the people running the platform are not in the business of letting fraudulent counts persist forever. The second systemic angle is the label leverage problem. Monthly listener numbers are not just bragging rights. They are negotiating tools. They are the foundation of touring guarantees, of brand partnership valuations, of publishing renegotiations, of every major business move an artist at this level makes. If your number is inflated, every deal you sign is built on a number that does not match the underlying demand. And when the number corrects, every deal downstream of it starts to look shaky. Touring guarantees get renegotiated. Brand partnerships hesitate. Streaming deals tighten. The entire financial architecture that gets built on top of a streaming number depends on that number being real. Because the people writing the checks are paying for the listeners they think you have, not the listeners you actually have. And when the gap between those two numbers is exposed, the checks start getting smaller, the deals start getting tighter, and the artist who is operating on the high end of leverage suddenly finds themselves on the low end of credibility. The third systemic angle is the media ecosystem that has been propping the narrative up. For years, certain outlets have been functionally on retainer for certain artists. Not in the sense of an envelope changing hands, but in the sense that access journalism is the only journalism that pays inside the hip-hop media space, and access is granted by the artists with the biggest platforms. So if you want to keep getting interviews, exclusives, premieres, and red carpet placements with the biggest artist in your coverage area, you frame the story the way that artist camp wants the story framed. That is not a conspiracy. That is just how the food chain works. The problem with that arrangement is that when the numbers underneath the artists start to slip, the media outlets that built their credibility around hyping that artist's every move start to look as exposed as the artist himself. They cannot pivot fast enough. The cosign machine breaks. And the audience, which has been getting its information through that filter for years, suddenly sees the filter for what it is. And that is what makes all of this just seem a little more important than a simple streaming dip. When you connect the platform incentive to detect fraud, the label leverage that depends on real numbers, and the media ecosystem that has been laundering the narrative for years, you do not have a story about one bad week on Spotify. You have a story about an entire scaffolding system that has been holding up a specific narrative, and you are watching it sag in real time. The numbers are the symptom. The system is the disease. And the cleaner that system gets, the more the disease becomes visible. Let me ask you something direct. Does it really make sense to you that an artist with the biggest active rollout in modern rap, with a label machine running at full output, with playlist saturation across every Spotify editorial vertical, is losing 1 million listeners in 24 hours? Or does it make more sense to you that a fraction of the scaffolding finally got pulled, the algorithm got cleaner, and what is left underneath is the real number, which is significantly lower than the number the celebration was built on? You already know the answer. You have known it for a long time. The data just finally caught up to what your gut has been telling you. So now we get to it. The real conversation. The truth bomb. And I want you to sit with this for a second, because if you understand nothing else from this entire breakdown, I need you to understand this. The 100 million monthly listener milestone was not the achievement Drake's camp told you it was. It was the moment the scaffolding became visible. And what makes this so devastating is not the number itself. It is what the number forced into the open. Because the moment you tell the world you have crossed a historic threshold, the world does what worlds do, which is to look at the threshold and ask if it is real. And the world looked, and the world is now saying, in increasingly loud and increasingly documented ways, that the threshold was inflated. The streaming farm operator, who reportedly named Drake as one of his biggest clients. The sleep playlist tactics that get circulated in fan group chats and are not a secret to anybody who has been paying attention. The geographic anomalies in the listener distribution that have been flagged repeatedly. The album rollouts where the debut numbers told one story and the second week numbers told a completely different story. The features that should have driven independent stream lifts and did not. All of it has been sitting in plain sight for years, and the entire architecture only stayed standing because nobody at the platform level had a reason to publicly look at it. The 100 million number gave them a reason, and when they looked, the number moved. By 1 million. In a day. And the most damaging part of this, the part that makes this not just a bad week, but a structural reset, is that the number is going to keep moving in the same direction. Because the platform is not finished cleaning. The cleaner the platform gets, the worse the inflation looks. And every subsequent data refresh becomes another opportunity for the real number to surface. So the question is not whether Drake is going to lose another million next week. The question is whether the floor is at 90, 80, or whether the actual organic ceiling, the number that represents real listeners pressing real play buttons on real songs they care about, is somewhere significantly below where the celebration was held. And here is the part nobody wants to say out loud. But I'm going to say it, because somebody has to. The reason the Drake camp is so loud about disqualifying Kendrick Lamar right now, the reason they invented the 6-album rule on the fly this week of all weeks, is because they can see the floor coming. They know what the next data, refresh, is going to show. They know what the second week numbers always look like compared to the debut numbers. They know what the bot scrub is going to do. And they are trying to get out in front of it by changing the conversation from a number conversation to a catalog conversation. Because they cannot win the number conversation anymore. The catalog conversation, where they get to pretend that volume equals greatness, is the only ground they have left. And even that ground is sinking, because the second you apply the 6-album rule consistently, you have to disqualify Biggie and Tupac, and nobody in their right mind is going to do that. So the rule does not apply. The number is not real. The narrative is collapsing. And the man at the center of it is sitting on a $100 million machine that has just been publicly exposed as running on numbers that do not survive scrutiny. That is the truth bomb. That is what this week actually was. And here is the part where the story finds its center. Because while all of this scaffolding is coming down on one side of the field, the other side of the field is completely undisturbed. Kendrick Lamar has not posted a desperate tweet, has not run a panic press cycle, has not dropped a counter diss to the Drake tracks aimed at him on the Iceman album, has not engaged with the noise in any meaningful public way. He is doing what he has always done, which is letting the work, the legacy, and the catalog do the arguing while he sits in the studio and prepares the next move. And that, more than anything else in this entire story, is the reason the loyalists are panicking. Because the most terrifying version of Kendrick Lamar to face, from a competitive standpoint, is the version that does not need to respond. The version that lets your own rollout collapse on its own weight while he quietly builds something larger. 6 albums. Pulitzer Prize. Super Bowl halftime show. Highest grossing rap tour in history. The most consequential diss campaign of the streaming era. The architect of a West Coast coalition that is producing headlines and cultural momentum without him even needing to be the lead artist. That is not a small catalog. That is a museum. And every single piece in that museum is either critically acclaimed, commercially dominant, or culturally rewiring. Good Kid, Mad City is, to this day, still on the Billboard 200. To Pimp a Butterfly is studied in universities. Damn won a Pulitzer Prize. Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers reframed therapy in mainstream rap. GNX sealed the post-battle era. 6 pieces. 6 classics. 6 cultural events. And the man who built it is sitting still, not promoting, not pushing, not begging the algorithm for relevance. And his monthly listener number is still parked at a level the man across the field just lost 1 million off of in a single day. One person makes music that has to be propped up by scaffolding to look like it is winning. The other one makes music that wins while he is sleeping. One catalog requires a press release every time a number moves. The other catalog is the press release. And the satisfying part of this entire week, the part that should land for anybody who actually cares about the integrity of this art form, is that the system is course-correcting in front of our eyes. The man who put in the work, who refused to flood streaming services with filler, who took his time, who chose every release with intention, who built a coalition instead of a clout farm, is the man who is still standing while the scaffolding around the other side comes down. That is not luck. That is not timing. That is what happens when integrity outlasts strategy. When the discipline of doing every job to 100% compounds over 15 years into a position that cannot be argued with. The numbers will fluctuate. The narratives will shift. The fan bases will keep inventing new disqualification rules every time the data goes the wrong way. But the catalog does not move. The Pulitzer does not move. The Super Bowl does not move. The tour records do not move. And the man at the center of it does not move either, because he never had to. He just kept working, and the field kept arranging itself around the work. And this is only the start. Because the conditions on the field right now are the exact conditions Kendrick Lamar has historically waited for before he releases. The opponent is exposed. The fan base is panicking. The narrative is open. The cultural appetite is hungry. And the man has a vault, a coalition, and a track record of timing that has never once been wrong. So I'm telling you right now, watch for two specific developments over the next 60 days. The first is any movement out of the PG Lang and TD orbit, because the coalition has been quietly stacking releases, features, and visual work, and a single coordinated rollout from that camp would absorb whatever oxygen is left in the Iceman cycle. The second is any data refresh from Spotify itself in the next two reporting windows, because if the 1 million listener drop was not a one-off, if the floor keeps moving down, the entire conversation around streaming credibility for certain artists is going to crack wide open, and we are going to be talking about it in every breakdown for the rest of the year. So make sure you are subscribed, because when those moves happen, and they're going to happen, you do not want to be hearing about them 3 days late from somebody else. Hit that subscribe button, turn the notification bell on, and stay locked in, because this story is nowhere near finished. And if you made it all the way down to this point in the video, thank you for watching. You are absolutely amazing, and that engagement is what keeps this channel running. So drop your honest matchups in the comments, because the second you write out which 6 Drake albums you would put up against Kendrick Lamar's 6 head-to-head, you understand exactly why the GOAT conversation is not really a conversation at all. And before you click off, you need to see the next piece of this puzzle, because the prequel to today's story has its own twist that almost nobody in the commentary space is talking about, including a leak situation that may have already changed Kendrick Lamar's next album rollout before he even announced it, with 2 specific names attached to the leak that connect directly back to the same circle we just broke down in this video. That is the breakdown you do not want to miss. Click the suggested video on screen, and I will see you in the very next one.